Okay, let's start. My name is Tirole. I'm the honor of chairing this roundtable on challenges for European innovation policy. This is a very important topic. Pharmaceutical has been, over the years, a very strong point in Europe, and now people are asking whether we can still be strong in front of the two giants, China and the US. And to answer this question and related questions, we have a very distinguished panel. We'll be hearing about decentralized approach or centralized ones. I mean, do we need industrial policy? How to do it? Can we do it with policies that are still nation at the nation level, like pricing and like procurement? So that's the kind of thing, and we'll go back to push and pull and all those things. And to answer the question, we have three distinguished experts. So from right to left for you, we have Taube, who is Director of Market Access and Orphan Drug Policy at the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries, EFPIA. Then we have Pedro Pita Barros, who is a professor of economics at Nova Business School in Economics, or Economics and Business School in Lisbon, and the economist here. I've seen Pedro many times. And Adrian Towse, who's a visiting fellow, but has been director for 25 years of the Office of Health Economics in the UK. And is currently doing research on AMR, if I'm correct. So when we prepared, we are very lucky to have the three of them. And when we prepared this session, I asked them how much time they wanted, and they all said 5 minutes. And then they renegotiated. Okay, it's 5 minutes, but it might run until 10 minutes. So I take 10 minutes to be a cap. And the first guinea pig for that will be Pedro. And he's going to show us how to do a speech within 5 minutes.
Now it is working. Great. Now, first of all, thanks for the kind invitation to be here. I feel like the warming up band in a concert, so I just have to entertain you before the other part. I'm trying to do that by setting up the stage for the discussion. In the sense that when we talk about pharmaceutical policy and pharmaceutical invention in Europe, we need to be aware that now we have basically three competing blocks. We have the US, Europe, and China. And each of these blocks have different skills, in a sense, or different strengths. Because you see on the US being a leader in the early innovation stages, they have the science, they have capital, they have regulatory flexibility, they have patient engagement, they have integration between academia, biotech, and finance. And where does Europe stand on the middle of this? Well, Europe has a strong scientific base, and it has regulatory credibility in a sense. And it usually gives more attention to patient rights, which may become more important in the future when you talk about equitable access when dealing with gene editing technologies and use of AI in drug discoveries. Those things may be in using data from people on setting targets for personalized medicine. Those things may come to the strengths of Europe. But we still have a major weakness in Europe, which is fragmentation. I'm going a little bit on fragmentation later on, but it's important that we have in mind the fragmentation word. What is then the strengths of China? China clearly is a powerful industrial scale-up. They are able to produce fast, quickly, and cheap. And that makes what we've seen over the years of having production moving to China. They have state-led coordination, which can help in many circumstances. And they have, in the recent past, strong state investments in biotech. And so they have also their own strengths. Where can be their weaknesses part? Well, they tend to have a limited scientific culture of open debate. And creativity in those conditions can be more difficult to nurture. And so in a sense, each of the blocks has different capabilities, but they are all fighting for the same goal, to lead in innovation, in pharma, and in other areas, actually. So what are the things that drag down European innovation policy? I think that I see several tensions or trade-offs, since we are economists on this. First, we have multiple objectives in Europe. We want to promote innovation that matters, which meaning focusing on unmet needs. We want quick access to innovation while financially protecting patients. And we want affordability of the health systems that are public. And having these three things together becomes complicated. That's one part. The second thing is the double fragmentation. And double fragmentation because you have different policies. So we have fragmentation across policies, but we also have fragmentation across countries. Different countries have different policies, and the European Union tries to have different policies on top of the national policies. So we have fragmentation on this area. Then we have a kind of tension between which model to use to reward innovation. Can you just play with the patent system as we have done over the last 2 centuries and have a decentralized model? Or do you want to use other public instruments that try to do more centralized innovation, that want to have some targets, that want to go for unmet need goals that are defined? And those will be very different models to go for. And then you have basically the philosophical approach that you may want to have on this. And here gives me the opportunity to mention the Blanchard-Tirole report. Being in Toulouse, I had to mention it, so I fulfilled my duty on that part, but also the Draghi report. And they have different approaches. If I'm trying to be fair, in the sense of saying that Blanchard-Tirole report focus on market failures, as an economist report will do, while the Draghi report focus more on sovereignty issues and how to go for that. And so we have to navigate the navigate the political part between these two different approaches. And in a sense, when you see the recent proposal for the Critical Medicines Act, they seems to be closer to the Draghi report in spirit, although sharing some of the ideas of the principles of correcting market failures. So what means defragmentation? Many things. I have here a list of 8 things at least that can be seen as fragmentation. But for the moment, I just mentioned 2 that are important and can be solvable. First is a common set of rules for many things. So joint clinical assessments is feasible to have a common set of rules. Equal prices is not going to be harder and probably not feasible. But having a capital markets union should be feasible to have venture capital for startups. So we have areas where you can have more, and I have more here if you want to go on that on the discussion. So we have possibilities to go for it. Then I have, I was asked to present some ideas of action points, right? That was, so I have to make starting to be creative. Some of them are very obvious, and we should be able to agree on those. Others are not so, maybe not so obvious, maybe not so consensual. First is make the European health data space work. And in a sense, if you have information that is going to be collected, and one of the strengths in Europe is having large panels of clinical data over years in several countries, is put all of that at the service of the research. And that should be feasible, and that is a kind of public good, or strong positive externals at least, that should justify the European intervention on this. And you have a large and diverse health data ecosystem that can be used for this. The second thing, from the Critical Medicines Act, it is said that we should use more sophisticated award criteria in public tenders. Is there? Well, that should be gold for us, right? Because if you're talking about sophisticated tenders with the MEET criteria, most economical advantageous tender criterion, then we should start going back to use economic theory to help design new public procurement procedures. And should be where we can contribute as economists, and should be also an area where you can do something very quickly. The other area is more broad, and I don't know exactly how to do it, but if you look on the countries, we have local innovation ecosystems. You have one in Central Europe, you have some decentralized a little bit for other countries. Scandinavia also has it a little bit. The question is how to make those local innovation ecosystems contribute to a global European innovation ecosystems. Now I look like a manager talking, right? That's why there was business in the school where I am. But the logic here is, can we think of ways of deconcentrating things on countries in terms of parts of this innovation ecosystem? So in a sense, one of the political tensions that you're going to have is how to distribute the gains of more innovation in Europe. And having in certain areas participation of smaller countries in parts of the supply chain of other products could be a way to do it. And so advanced the therapy medicinal products probably can have research done in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Finland. And then you may have other parts of the chain, the supply chain, located in Belgium and Poland, and we have some things later on Germany, and be part of a global part. So you need to think about how to make this work. One of the goals of the Draghi report in the general policy part is to bring to Europe some of the manufacturing that is being done elsewhere. So here, what could be an action? Set an European manufacturing accelerator for biopharmaceuticals, EMAB. I created the name. But the point is, have an European initiative on this and bring to Europe something that can spur innovation in different locations inside Europe. And so you'll have something to work with. Now, one of the strongest points of Europe that usually is mentioned is education and training. Probably going to see this in all the reports. So what we do with that education and training? Most of the time we think about just scientists and people doing the science, but probably should think about how to use patient-expert integration into research, because patient experts can bring good directions for research, can avoid Me Too, can bring something different, and also give a sense of being a legitimate research because it's also being driven by the patients. And for that, we have experience in Europe with several patient associations doing a very professional job. My challenge here is to create a European Patient Expert Academy for professional training and certification of patient experts. And the idea is we don't want just associations of patients doing this. We want patients that are able to understand science and participate in the design of the projects, in the steering a bit of how things are done. And they are not just there to be recruited for clinical trials. So patients can do much more, and we can use their knowledge to do much more in terms of directions of science. So they will bring, if you want to put economic jargon, patients can bring demand-side signals by having involvement in priorities and giving legitimacy to the use of public funds. And finally, we could use joint procurement for innovation, addressing unmet needs. So it's just not just joint procurement, it's joint procurement for innovation. Define an unmet need, gather several countries that put some funds and that will procure the innovation, getting the results, which is in a bit in the spirit of what was being said in the morning by David on getting these pool incentives. Let's try to get this. And the idea is to have a governance process where you don't need to have every country participating. It is the coalition of the willing in joining this joint procurement for innovations. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pedro, for this big picture and those helpful suggestions. Now we are going to turn to Tina, who is also going to give you a big picture for our tiny smartphone. Tina?
Thank you very much. So the beauty of being prepared is when the speaker, which is first, saying a little bit different things when you prepared for. So therefore, I will skip a little bit what I put on my little smartphone and reflect a little bit on what you were saying. So when we talk about innovation policies for pharmaceutical, what is our objective? What is the goal we wish to achieve? And the goal from an industry perspective is very clearly that we wish to have a European market which is competitive within the global setting, what we heard, thinking of China and the US, that we still see future investment in Europe. So, and if this is the goal, then we need to reverse the trend. So now, what is the trend? We see over the last 30 years that 1/4, so 25% in terms of R&D investment went elsewhere. It's gone from Europe. We also see that although clinical trials are globally increasing by almost roughly 40%, the share of Europe declined heavily from 21 to 12. So less clinical trials for patients, meaning less access to those treatments, meaning less exposure by physicians, by nurses to those type of innovation. When we see the investment gap between Europe and the US, just focusing on those two markets, we had 20 years ago, 2 billion, we have now 25. So this is the trend we are in. So now, what can we do to reverse the trend? And a lot of ideas have been mentioned. The beauty of Europe is that we have now 27 countries who all have ideas, and this is great. But this also makes it complex and lengthy in discussing how should policies look like in order to achieve goals we can all somehow sign on to. So when we think now of the trend I've just explained with some figures, what is needed to reverse it? So first of all, we need a better cohesion of policies, what we do see at European level. We talk about currently, and this was the piece not mentioned yet, we currently revise the pharmaceutical legislation at European level, which is 20 years old. But what is the fundamental difference to ensure we get the incentives and the reward rights? We know how to manufacture things. We know how flexible pathways for regulatory processes should look like at EMA, so the European Medicines Agency. How to address shortages, supply is part of this discussion. So that's one piece. The other piece is that we have tons of other discussions around other legislations that partly contradict each other. So therefore, we need to get better in streamline those efforts and avoid contradicting efforts to achieve certain objectives. The second piece is that we need to have this revision of the pharmaceutical legislation really as an opportunity to get it right. And this means we need to modernize the regulatory framework, what we have, because it's rather old and it's rather slow compared to the rest of the world. And the third pillar, which is, of course, the access piece. Access meaning that, unfortunately, we do not have access in all the 27 member states because this varies very much on how a healthcare system is set up, how pricing and reimbursement policies are set up, because that's not a European responsibility. This lies with the member states. And the system works different from France to Germany to Belgium to wherever in the European Union. So meaning, if this is the objective also to solve the access issue, where we also can agree on, because there is no value in having the products approved, but they're not reaching the patients, then we need to find solutions for this as well. But how the European Union currently addresses this and try to fix and have this one-size-fits-all idea as part of the legislative review, that's probably not take us there. So therefore, we need to think a bit more precisely, how can we collaborate amongst the markets to make it happen, but also how healthcare system in itself can be, I'm not saying modernized, that's the wrong word, but what do we need to do in order to speed up and rewarding those innovations which are available but do not reach the patients for now? And I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sina. It's very interesting. Let's conclude with Adrian, and then we'll take some questions from the floor, and then maybe we'll go back to the panel for answers.
Thank you. So like Tina, I'm not going to talk about R&D, although I'm happy to in response to questions and comments from the audience, but to concentrate on Europe as an effective purchaser. So Europe should be and is one of the major purchasers of medicines. It's a driver of innovation. So how it behaves is crucial to the sort of innovation and investment that we're likely to see from the industry. So again, as Tina mentioned, a critical context is we don't have a common EU-wide health system. There may be a strong argument for setting one up, but it would require massive transfers of resources between the richer countries and the less rich ones within the European Union. And realistically, it's not on the horizon in terms of the planning that the Commission needs to do at the present time. So in that context, it's worth bearing in mind, if we look at the Eurostat for statistics for 2022, the last year we have, then there are 27 member states, 9 have purchasing power adjusted healthcare expenditure per patient above 4,000 euros. 9 have expenditure below 2,000 euros, and 9 are in between. So you've got a very nice sort of three-way division there. So when we come to talk about a single pharmaceutical market, we need to differentiate between, if you like, access to the market. So there's one license that gets you able to sell your medicine in all of these different 27 different healthcare systems, from what we would ultimately like to achieve, which is patients wherever they live in the European Union being able to get hold of those medicines through their local healthcare systems if their disease requires it. And in order to deliver the second, in a 27 member states different health system environment, we need differential pricing. And as Patricia Danzen and I wrote sort of over 10 years ago, if we want second best, as in we've got patent protection, optimal dynamic and static efficiency, then what we want is each of those healthcare systems to be pricing at the margin, paying for value, the value to their local healthcare system of those new interventions. And that's going to be different in each of those 27 member states. So when we talk about access and we talk about price convergence, then if we're thinking of price convergence at a list level in Europe, then we're going to reduce both static and dynamic efficiency. We'll have less innovation overall and less access. And as Tina said, there are already significant delays, not unsurprisingly, delays in access because of the challenges of pricing, particularly in the lower 9 countries member states that I talked about. So we need confidential discounts or a similar solution. I'll come back to that. But the centre does have to help and make this happen and also deliver the architecture that we need. And the Draghi report identifies ways in which in the health sphere we can have better central architecture. It talks about improvements at the EMA, also talks about the joint clinical assessments, the first element of value assessment at local member states, the potential for having a central body, European-led, to coordinate that, and also the need for procurement through the Critical Medicines Act. And I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. So my 3 proposals to take things forward. The first one is to delete all references to transparency in all EU policy documents, because we're either talking about cost plus, we're talking about transparency of costs, in which case we're thinking that prices should be related to how much a company has spent to develop a product, rather than what its value is to the healthcare system. And one of the key proposals in the health section of Blanchard and Tirole is that healthcare systems need to be driving forward by rewarding interventions according to the health gain that they are delivering. And that's the way we get better performing healthcare systems. Or we're talking about transparency of pricing, where we're really trying to get external reference pricing, where a high per capita spend European country can reference a low price country and effectively lead to that country no longer having access to that lower price. So secondly is to encourage net price diversity, which follows on from that. And again, in a paper I did with others now 10 years ago, there's three ways that you can do it pays, or Belgium will agree that it will pay 5 times or 3 times what Bulgaria pays. Commission could try and organize that. That might be a tough one. Or we could have zones, a little bit like peak load pricing. We could have 2 or 3 zones of pricing where there's no reference pricing across those allowed, and parallel trade is restricted in some ways. Or the simplest option is to promote and encourage confidential discounts. So it's not possible to see. And that's something that the Commission, in my view, should be actively trying to do. And linked to that is our institutions, and I think this is mentioned in the Draghi report, like the Benelux. So having local groups of countries of similar healthcare systems that are acting together to conduct HTA health and to buy pharmaceuticals. And so I can envisage a situation in which those 27 member states become, you've got the big 4, and let's suppose you had 3 other groups around Europe who were coordinating the negotiations they did for prices, pharmaceuticals that provided access for all their citizens within that group. So in other words, you had something like 6 or 7 big purchases in Europe, which is not dissimilar to what we have in the US healthcare system. So that's the sort of thing that the European Commission ought to be encouraging and promoting in order to try and increase access, but also recognize the importance of having some element of bargaining power. So my final suggestion is on central procurement to the Critical Medicines Act. And I think it's crucial here that we recognize when that's needed and when it's not. So for me, the key use of that is when there's an element of market failure, which I think Pedro referred to. And the critical ones that we have are where there is in principle some willingness to buy across the 27 member states, but it needs coordination and signaling and an advanced commitment to the innovators that the money will be made available. And the obvious example we've already had is in the pandemic, where the advanced procurement contracts were absolutely essential. There was a second issue on shortages because initially there wasn't going to be enough vaccine for every citizen in the European Union. So there needed to be some agreement as to which citizens were going to get it in what sort of order, which brings me to the second element, the Critical Medicines Act, which is shortages, where we've got issues with off-patent medicines. Clearly, patients and countries want access to off-patent medicines that cost peanuts. But if we have shortages because they force prices down too much or whatever, exactly the area where Commission's central procurement can coordinate and signal to those off-patent manufacturers that if they invest, then the purchasing will take place. And the third one, of course, is my favorite that we're going to be discussing tomorrow morning. So I'll just touch on it briefly, which is antimicrobial resistance, where the is to be putting money on the table in advance in a coordinated way that says, if you bring this product to market with these attributes, then this money will come to you. So it seems to me it's the area where the 27 are not able to, or the coordination has to take place ex ante, is where you need the Critical Medicines Act and that advanced purchasing. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Adrian. I've heard lots of interesting things and proposals. I suggest the first round of questions. Who has 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll go back to the panel.
So going back to innovation, I know this may sound hopelessly naive after Liberation Day, but in some sense, the innovation incentives for these firms should be global to some extent, and so. Hearing your thoughts on the kind of changes we might need in Europe to put those in a global context, thinking of the market for Ozempic in the US, for example. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Let's collect a couple of questions.
John Rex here, the non-economist in the room. Europe has a really interesting advantage that the US does not have for drug development, in that the European legal basis of approval is that benefit exceeds risk. And that's it. That's the wording. Benefit exceeds risk. The US has a much more challenging hurdle of substantial evidence of efficacy based on adequate and well-controlled clinical trial investigations, tattoo on the inside of your glasses. And I've all along thought that, Tina, I see your role in orphan drug policy. I've long thought that rare diseases should be a place where Europe would lead and could use that as a tool for showing how to produce things with smoother regulation that would potentially be attractive across all of Europe. So that's sort of my challenge, because the ideas that are floating out here are good. And I was looking for something that Europe could do that the US can't. And you'll clearly can detect that I am from the US, and I can only apologize so many times for the US's bad behavior recently. So over.
Is that there is eroding, thank you. There is eroding patent protections in Europe, and that specifically some countries are deciding to compulsory license and or simply not actually compulsory license, simply make the product in a compounding product format and get around all of this business altogether, which is having its own negative impact on the possibility of launching products, especially in the rare disease setting in Europe.
So last year in this room, at this time, we had extensive discussions about software and information technology in innovations, particularly including digital twinning and software as a medical device that needed to be regulated. It seems, following on my countryman's appeal, that one place Europe has a comparative advantage or an absolute advantage is in integrating brick and mortar medicine with information technology. And so I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay, so I suggest, who wants to speak first and answer all those questions?
I can go, or
Happy to go back on the IP discussion, the question from the lady, and then also elaborating a bit on the orphan, the OMP discussion. So what is currently happening in the discussion is when we talk about the pharmaceutical legislative review, we talk about incentives. And one incentive, this is one of the few aspects where Europe has a competitive advantage, to be very clear here. And this goes with the current system of regulatory data protection of 8-year plus 2+1. So what does it mean? You have the regulatory data protection plus market exclusivity. So this is currently discussed, and the proposal, so if you're familiar with European legislative process, so how does it work? The Commission proposed something, then the Parliament needs its position, the Council needs its position, and then the Parliament and the Council come back together to negotiate the final text. And this is where we are right now. None of them strengthen this incentive, all of them reducing it, or couple it with further obligations which are not in the sole responsibility of the manufacturer, of the developer. So therefore, to launch a product, it takes two, meaning the developer plus the member state. And I'm just might be a bit very strong here in this, but this is the competitive advantage we have compared to other regions in the world. Very few, but the point is it's not strengthened. How we discuss it for the time being, we talk about a reduction, a modulation of this incentive, and this creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates less investment. So that's maybe one thing to your question. Now, when it comes to the orphan medicinal product, that's the same. Here we have the concept of market exclusivity for those products, and if there is a product on the market which is for a product treating a rare disease, and there is another competitor, a second one, you have to show a significant benefit. So meaning there is already the mechanism of, if there is something, the other one has to be better. But again, this regulation is really a success story for Europe over the last 20 years, and we've seen a lot of development we wouldn't have seen without this regulation. But this is under revision as well, and incentives are reduced as well. Plus, the orphan medicinal products are always the example for access challenges, because there you go automatically into discussing what is the value. So you run through your HTA process, you have challenges dedicated to those products where we talk about very, very few patients. And then, of course, there is always the budget discussion afterwards. So what is this worth for the society to have the product available where 5 patients, generally children, have access to? So yes, it's a strength, the incentives we currently have, but it's revised and we don't know where we might come out with that. So therefore, we as industry are very clearly on saying this is the opportunity we need to get right, explicitly in the contents with the tariff discussion we are in with the US.
Okay, I'm just going to just take some of the points. Let me take first the global thing that Otto was mentioning. There, probably it's true that we have to think about global, but all of them are thinking global. So probably think Europe should not be just Europe's 27. Actually, I think that we should have a kind of a tiers for this. We should have Europe 27 plus the UK plus Norway and probably plus Switzerland. I think it should be stuck together. These countries should have a common certainty in rules. I think that makes sense of all of them. And then probably should have a second tier of geopolitical uncertainty or certainty that you may want to build. That will have Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Canada, because they will be industrial and R&D partners that could be useful in our different geographies. They don't have the size to compete immediately with Europe, and then that could be a feasible way to connect all of those. One thing that's quite clear is that no country in Europe, even the largest one, has the ability to alone compete with the US or with China. And so we're going to need some sort of coalition in terms of these things. So the European Union can actually do that by looking on ways to on the places first where you can see clear market failures or things that need to be corrected. I think that's the first question for that. So that was for the first question. Now on the IP, already got to that. On the other parts, or what are the main strengths that European has? I think that's clear. It's not easy to see. At least it was not obvious to me what were the main things that Europe can do that better than the others. And actually there, I think that the regulatory environment could be turned into a strength if we change a couple of things. I think that's a good point. But again, I go back to my idea that we should use more patient information in directing research to get faster and earlier to critical elements. And I think that for that part, and even on that side, the US have actually better integration of patients into research processes, but we can leapfrog on that, as we can eventually leapfrog on the issues of use of artificial intelligence applied to health. Because if you think about applications of artificial intelligence, probably they have a huge application everywhere, and probably discussed that last year, going from the molecular to the bedside of the patient. And so we just need to think where to go. But some of these things probably need to do in a decentralized way. So we need to have places in Europe that come with ideas, and then there are ways to aggregate those ideas to bring them to the market later on. That's where the Capital Markets Union will become part, or innovation hubs could be part of it. If people can contribute, they know how to contribute to innovation hub. I think that we need to have kind of different models of governance. So the speed that Tina was talking about is not just in terms of the regulatory processes for approvals. I think also the decisions of when to put money into some idea or to help some groups to collaborate, we should have kind of better way to do that and use the different ideas that appear inside the European Union and at least this small tier around with Switzerland, UK, and Norway. That probably will be a good way to direct research in really decentralized efforts. What else was in thing? I think that I covered the things that I could. Okay, thank you. Adrian.
Thanks, Pedro. Yeah, a couple of points. So first on the market access question, the intellectual property that Rena raised that Tina talked about. So again, I think this again reflects confusion about what we mean by market access, and what the Commission should be doing. So the proposal, as I understand it, is regulatory data protection. So as in a new entrant can't use your clinical data as long as it's protected. Then the availability of that, the current availability, you would only get under the new proposals if you made your products available in a number of member states. So in other words, the implication is that you would set up local organizations, so you were launching the product. All of those would be loss-making because you didn't have an agreement with the local health system to use the product. And so you wouldn't have achieved access in the sense that we all want, as in patients able to get those medicines, because the fundamental problem is essentially the prices that are being paid and the difficulty of conducting negotiations across 27 healthcare systems. And arguably the Commission should be looking at that problem rather than some sort of artificial, we're going to take away our IP unless you do ABC, when ABC won't actually address the problem. Second point is on the point about data. And indeed, the Draghi report, and I think the Commission's proposals refer to the EHDS, the European Health Data Space, which is absolutely crucial, offers enormous potential for improving the competitive and attractiveness of Europe as a clinical base, but also as a place to launch medicines. And the importance of that is because what we're increasingly seeing, and John alluded to it in his question about the benefit risk approval, is much more rapid approval by regulatory bodies of products. They then go into the health system, try and negotiate, but actually we don't have all the evidence we need about how well that product is going to work. So at best, you're going to get delays, or more appropriately, in my view, you'll get conditional approvals subject to additional evidence being collected and a review of whatever price has been agreed with rebates or whatever. And so the ability to collect European health data that will enable companies to conduct those studies and generate the evidence that the local payers want about how well in practice is this treatment working, what is it delivering for the patients in my healthcare system, I think is absolutely crucial, a fantastic opportunity. It is in there, and it's about the extent to which the Commission will be able to invest and put effort into making it a reality.
Well, thank you. If I can add my 2 cents on what can we do better. I think it's very difficult to tell. I mean, what we can do is to express a demand, like in AMR, for example, and also have the conditions ready for the industry actually to make this happen. But I think we have to be humble in terms of our approach. And in a sense, that's what BARDA and DARPA and NIH and SF, ERC are doing. You know, there's a market for ideas, and then you select among those ideas. Let me do a little bit more advertising. I already had a lot. They were very kind to mention one of my reports. Another report I wrote a year and a half ago with people at Bocconi and Munich was about what Horizon Europe does, which is basically the budget for research, which was heralded as being the new DARPA for Europe. It turns out that when we looked at things, about 5% of the 11 billion euros, which is already not much, 5% was on disruptive innovation. So we were completely beside the point. And, the way it was attributed was, through collaboration, insisting on very large collaboration and basically spreading the money around in small amounts to lots of people. So we needed to have, you need to have a partner in Bulgaria, in Germany, in Spain, in Portugal. I like Pedro's approach of saying, well, there's always an issue of distribution. If you take the best, it's like with the ERC, it's going to be very uneven. The excellence in research is not going to be spread uniformly, and basically you need to have some kind of pork barrel somewhere to compensate the countries which don't have the top university they like. I mean, not that we have the top university in Europe, but clearly it's unevenly distributed, and we have to think about that. But of course, Horizon Europe is not the only obstacle to doing innovation and progressing. I mean, you all know the standard primes with labor market institutions, with universities, with energy cost, with fragmentation. It has been mentioned many times. It's not only regulations, labor markets, financial markets, national spending, and also a lot of non-tariff barriers. I don't know if you have seen the IMF report like a year or two ago on the implicit tariff that are imposed inside Europe. It's awful. It's really awful. They use gravity model to try to understand what are the implicit tariffs in Europe. Of course, there are non-price instruments, but it's very high. And the truth is that we have the intra-trade within Europe is less than half the intra-trade within the US. It's not great. So it echoes a number of things that we discussed. The financing of things is difficult as well, given the institutions. So if you want to tax a company, and opting out gives you a huge instrument for free riding. Actually, we are still working with Pierre and Paul-Henri Moisson on the paper, explaining that it's actually very difficult to actually form a cooperative of countries on that basis. And that's why the idea of vouchers, which will be discussed tomorrow, was launched. I mean, that was a political economy reason, because for the vouchers, you may not need to have the political approval. In the same way, we don't use a carbon tax in Europe, we use an ETS system for the same reason. Now, what's more interesting for an economist, of course, is whether vouchers are economically interesting or not. That's a different thing that we've also worked on, but that's the important thing. Now, the difficult questions for you is, okay, Draghi says exactly the same thing as the three participants have said. Basically, we have a huge amount of fragmentation, which hampers R&D and many other things. How do we deal with that? And there's a good reason why we have the fragmentation. And if you have any solution to, Draghi doesn't really talk about it. The point is that why is that 10%, less than 10% of the R&D grants are awarded at the European level, like Horizon Europe and so on. 90% is awarded at the domestic level. We all know that's inefficient to do it at the domestic level, and therefore you need to centralize things. But of course, the countries don't want that. They want to be able to distribute the chocolates, and you can go through all the primes we have cited. It's always a chocolate issue. The countries want, the politicians and wants to keep, and the agencies want to keep distributing the chocolates. And that's why you have 27 distribution of chocolates in Europe. So if you have any solution, that will be great. And sometimes we have trick to centralize things, but it's pretty hard. I suggest now that we have a second round of questions. And perhaps there will be some stuff about industrial policy. I mean, you have already mentioned a little bit industrial policy, but that's something that we need to hear more about. Maybe distinguishing between disruptive innovation and paracetamol, right? Which obeys different rules, but raises interesting issues also with the allocation and the price discrimination that have already been mentioned.
A couple of times you mentioned the idea that the EU may not be able to compete with the US or China on some dimension. I'd love to hear you expand on that a little bit, because from my perspective, it seems like there's less, at least when we're thinking about innovation, it's less about competition and more about it being a team project where we all benefit from what we learn from friends around the world.
So in your introductions, you mentioned joint procurement as a solution to maybe access and affordability problems in Europe. So, I mean, there are already, member states can do this already today. So they can come together and form buyer clubs. And some of the member states do, like you mentioned, the Benelux case. There's a Nordic buyer club, and there's also a Baltic, relatively small countries, right? But they come together to form a buyer club for medicines. When we look at the evidence now, I mean, it seems it works for some generics okay-ish, not for all of them, but it works for a very limited number of medicines, or it seems to work only for a limited number of medicines, and not so much, if at all, for innovative medicines. So I would like to hear your views a bit more on, whether you have ideas, how to make those clubs more successful that already exist today, or, what would need to be done to, make this work? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I heard so many times the word commission that I feel almost obliged to comment or to ask questions. Following up on your factory of chocolate, I wanted to ask a question to Tina, because, for example, we will talk about it tomorrow, about EMR, but DG HERA, they provided the scheme, European scheme, for antibiotics, right? But unfortunately, industry did not decide to sign the contracts. So on one hand, we want harmonization, but on the other hand, we hear that industry prefers bilateral agreements at national level. So a little bit, if you can comment on that. Second thing, you mentioned also of course, pharmaceutical legislation reform. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that some legislation, they contradict each other. Could you please elaborate a little bit what you meant on that and give us some examples? And last comments about incentives. So the audience is aware that really Europe has the most generous one. So we need to reflect a little bit how to have optimal one that works both for industry, for SMEs, for academia, but also for member states and healthcare systems, because of course, some innovation is costly. So just for audience to be aware about this. Thanks.
A last question.
In a lot of the discussions about the health of the drug development system in the US, I always hear a lot of conversation about venture capital. And I haven't heard any perspectives on venture capital here. We've heard a lot about grants. So I wanted to get some commentary on why that is going off radar in the panel, if structural or maybe just not ripe for policy action.
Okay, I don't know if who wants to answer. I can actually answer the question on venture capital, because we actually have a lot of financing in Europe. Also, there's some crowding out by public agencies like in France, but the venture capitalists are in the US. In the US, they come to Europe, but they get a return which is half of the return elsewhere. So in the end, you still have lots of European investing in the US instead. So I don't think, personally, I mean, maybe the next speakers will have a different view, but I think it's not a shortage of capital. And by the way, Horizon Europe is a lot about remedying capital market imperfection. I said, only 5% for disruptive innovation, but much of the rest is about helping SMEs, to be honest. And just one point about what makes cooperatives work. There's a very, very interesting book by Henry Hensman, who is a lawyer at the Yale Law School, where he works. He talks about various cooperatives, and there is one theme that comes back all the time: is congruence. You know that in department, in university, and whatnot. If you have all the same goal, then it's going to work. If you start having different goals, and yes, case studies for that. If you have different goals, you are going to fight and not agree, not share information, and it's a mess. So that's the thing. And that goes back to the previous debate, which is, there is one clear area where we disagree on pharmaceutical within Europe, is who is going to pay, right? And if we don't solve this issue, either through a fixed formula, which is income-based or something like that, or some maybe some non-transparency, whatever, we'll be facing an issue. I think we'll be and right now everybody is going his own way, and it's not going to work. So cooperatives work when there's a lot of congruence, period.
So I got the microphone, so I will start. On the point from the lady over there with regard to the competitiveness comparison to the US, well, the Draghi report and now also the new commission puts the, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry as one of the strategic sector which should be kept in Europe. And this is great. This is a good step forward. However, what we see in terms of legislative discussion, we do not necessarily see this step really going there. So therefore, if there is really agreement on keeping industry here or seeing as a strategic sector, then we need to walk the talk. And we are not doing this right now in this regard. On the other points, the lady over there mentioned a couple of points. So examples of cohesion when we talk about legislation. We have the pharmaceutical legislative review, and we have a PFAS discussion on restricting PFAS. So both of them have a right to be discussed and to be regulated. If PFAS is restricted not to be used in medicines manufacturing processes, this means over 600 products are affected, which are all on the WHO critical medicines list. This is a contradiction. The other contradiction is, or let's say not necessarily contradiction, but a bit with cautious, we have the Pharma Review and we have the Critical Medicines Act to be discussed. Both of them try to address shortages within medicine. So we need to ensure that both are going in the same direction in a way that we do not double down on efforts which could contradict each other. And the last point I wanted to make is on the incentive piece. Getting incentives right, which are good for industry and member states. I think the fundamental issue, what the Commission tried to address, is using a hammer because there was a nail, and the hammer was the pharma legislation to ensure further investment, and the nail is the access challenge what we have. And it's not denied from an industry perspective. We do have a situation when it comes to access. We need to find a solution, but we are not with the Commission that this solution can be found centralized at a European level, because we have realities and member states are responsible for the healthcare system. So therefore, we call for a long time to get together to discuss what can be done. We put forward a concept, a bit of similar to what Adrian was mentioning, equity-based tier pricing concept. Can we discuss it to address parallel trade, to address international price referencing, to discuss about tiering of countries, just to have some ideas to move the discussion.
Okay, I'm having trouble organizing myself on this. Let's start for the following. I'm going to start by going back to one point that was raised by Adrian. And the point is we're not going to have a European health system, period. Countries are too different. Countries have different traditions. Countries have different preferences. And this is going to be very hard to do, if not impossible. So what we have to think about is how can we make this diversity of European health systems, instead of a weakness, some kind of a strength. That's where we have to think carefully. And when you think about this, the Critical Medicines Act, probably the best thing that we can do, and this is a challenge for each of you in this room, just after this, Google it, get the fact sheet. After seeing the fact sheet, which is 2 pages, read the document. It's a pain, I know. I've done it, but then get papers out on what is the economic view on it. It's our contribution to that discussion, because there's lots of things in there. One of them is saying that they want joint procurement. And for joint procurement, you need to have at least, for some parts of it, 9 countries participating. For other things, you need 3. Why should have a limit on the countries? Should it be just joint procurement to get lower prices, or should it be the joint procurement for innovation, trying to get funds together to go for something that we think that will be important? I think that's where we can eventually do better in Europe, and it can play to the strengths of Europe. Is going to be the need for some investment on industrial policy, as Jean was mentioning? Probably, yes. That's where I think the ATMPs could play a role. If you create a top technology ATMP factory in Europe, so advanced therapies, medicine products, we can get into the bandwagon and avoid everything going to China for the clinical trials or in the US for the ideas. It's risky, yes, but we need to put funds together to get to that. Now, the critical point of not having a unique health system, so having this fragmentation, is also that we cannot forget the political science / political economy within Europe. And that's going to be very different from all the other blocks. We cannot think to emulate the US. We're not going to be there for a million years probably, and the same thing for China with a different structure. So we need to think what are the strengths of Europe by being diverse and play with them. We're going to need different governance mechanisms. I think so, for sure. And when you think about the discussions in Europe, sometimes I think we go backwards. Actually, when you talk about that word that became fashionable, resilience, people think about stockpiling. But resilience is not about stockpiling. Resilience is about getting information fast and knowing how to mobilize resources to solve an unforeseen crisis. So that's about decision. It's about governance. It's not about stockpiling. And that's where parts of it will have to go on Europe in general, and also in this particular area. So on the question about the joint procurement, the examples that were given, so the Benelux A, the Visegrad group, the Scandinavian group, and the fourth group is La Valletta, which takes the south of Europe. Those are buying clubs. They want to get together to buy at the cheapest price. What I think is a challenge is to turn that around and make those groups probably aggregated and not being just groups of countries with a fixed geometry, but with variable geometry for different needs that we may identify. Just procure the innovation for it. Launch the initiatives to put enough money on it. On this part, I think that we have a lot to learn with the US and part. So I like a lot the example of the Warp Speed program. We had 3 competing technologies with 2 projects in each of the technologies. You end up with 6 things. And that's where competition between technologies, competition within technology, and we can learn from that. I'm sure that in Europe, if we had the same amount of money to put, we just try to select one, and we'll be having the large countries competing for which one will have it. So that's the kind of mechanisms that we need to overcome, in a sense, how to make fragmentation helpful in a world where we can not going to centralize, but we need to concentrate efforts, which is different from centralizing. On the distribution of chocolates, I love chocolate. but probably should build the best chocolate factory first, and then just hand over the distribution from that part. And I think that will be nicer to do. Let me see if I have missed. Oh, another example that I like on the political science part of this is with the pandemic and the joint procurement that we had for vaccines, we did not see countries fighting each other to have access to the vaccines inside the European Union, which means that the European Union, in a moment of crisis, was able to get a process by which each country found it fairly treated. I think that we could learn from that part on the political science as well, and it's up to us to do that part, contribute to that part as well. Okay, sorry for my campaigning speech. I'm running for president of something. Please vote for me.
Just going to reply to a couple of the points. The chocolate factory, I just wonder if one way forward at the moment, Jean was saying Horizon is effectively 10% of R&D money. Is there a way of increasing that, say, to 15%, but having some expanded requirement to have certain groups of countries involved in any application? I mean, I know at the moment you have to, Horizon, you have to involve universities or institutions from several European countries. Could you specify which groups, at least one or more of them, have to come from? So could you make it more likely that, for example, the Hungarian health minister knows that when the announcement is made, there's almost certainly going to be some Hungarian institutions who will have won part of the competition, so he will or she will have something to announce. So anyway, I throw that into the chocolate factory kind of issue. Other quick point is on joint procurement and the buyer clubs. And I think that they differ at the moment, but Benelux has certainly been trying to conduct joint HTA and look at how they buy new drugs. But what I would say is it takes time. If we look at the joint clinical assessment, the Commission started funding programs of work on that 30 years ago. And so what I'm talking about is the Commission thinking about how it can support those sorts of groups in developing value-based purchasing amongst similar health systems in a way that combines bargaining power with efficient purchasing and makes a European market a little bit more consolidated, but recognizing we have 27 healthcare systems. And the other part of joint procurement, pandemic purchasing in vaccine purchasing was a huge success, a great triumph for the Commission. Let's be very clear about that, in my view. So we're thinking about how we take the strengths of that into the Critical Medicines Act. And for me, and again, I don't want to anticipate the discussion tomorrow on purchasing for antimicrobial resistance, but there the critical thing is we need to get money up front, and it needs to be not linked to volume. And that's a very interesting and challenging way of purchasing, which is exactly the sort of area that the Commission can do something that the member states would find unbelievably difficult to do for themselves. They still have to consent. They're the ones buying the medicines or putting the money up, but the Commission has an absolutely crucial role in coordinating and making it all happen, which is where the central procurement should take place.
Thank you, Adrian. On the distribution, which seems a crucial issue, distribution of money, I will notice that if you look at the US, where the money of NSF, NIH, BARDA, and whatnot goes, or the ERC in Europe for that matter, it goes to certain places. It goes to Boston, it goes to Silicon Valley, and doesn't go to Nebraska, right? And it's pretty obvious, and that's efficient that way. Of course, you have to compensate Nebraska in some way, and that's really our challenge. And in Europe, the ERC has been extremely good at emphasizing excellence. And in the end, it's very unequal distribution. It goes to England, etc. I mean, we know to Germany and so on. So that's we have to find a way of doing the same thing as the Americans do, because otherwise we are going to waste the money. I mean, to put it bluntly. So I'm not colluding, but I'm going to give the last question or questions to Pierre.
Okay, so thank you. So I will be very short because I think we should stop now. So I just wanted, so it was great, and I agree with a lot of things that has been said. I really wanted to hear from you and maybe Tina to understand, and maybe tomorrow we can discuss this again with Alexandra, to understand the reasons why this pharmaceutical legislation is modifying the incentives in the way they want to modify. So maybe the answer would be too long, but I still don't understand their logic. And then there are many topics on which we know. There are things we don't know. We know it's complicated, but there are things that we know. And for example, reference pricing, there are some papers on that. We know the negative impact of reference pricing. We know the negative impact of parallel trade. We know all this. We have plenty of papers. And I still don't understand why this does not diffuse in policy circles and in decision makers. Sometimes we have papers that show that it's a win-win situation, that reforms are favorable for the state and for the companies. It's not even like, some parties is going to have to accept some reduction in profits or increase in expenses. So sometimes it's win-win. And yeah, maybe that's part of our job now to disseminate a bit better what we do, but yeah. And then we need to close quickly.
Do you have any reaction to Pierre?
Just very briefly, I try to be brief. On the modulation aspect, if you look at the objectives from the Commission, is clearly to address the access challenge what we have. And the idea is if you modulate incentives towards unmet medical need, we get what we need, and then those products, because we know what we need, have earlier access. We don't agree to this idea of thinking. So that's the quick response to the first one. The second piece, I think one of the main obstacles to get those ideas in with, tiered pricing, value-based pricing, outcome-based pricing, whatever it might be in the end, is that system planning is usually for 1 year. So the budget is for 1 year, and all those ideas require a longer time frame. I think this is a very technical clash where we have an issue and why some of the ideas are probably not taken up.
Okay, thanks a lot. Two things. The first is to thank the three panelists for a great panel, lots of ideas. Thanks so much.